The discussion had by now taken a turn for the better and was no longer disagreeably personal, and Monsieur Duprat, zealous in military controversies, adopted a rather dogmatic tone in refuting, with some reason, as it seemed to me, what the emperor laid down in the tone of a master who expects silence rather than disagreement. The ambassador even seemed to allow himself more freedom in his observations than would have been permissible in private conversation. He saw safety only in what we no longer possessed, well-organized and well-paid armies, and he asserted that without money, not a horse nor a man could be hoped for in the duchy. Then what do the Poles want? The emperor demanded sharply. It is for them we are fighting, for them that I have lavished my treasure. If they mean to do nothing for their own cause, it is useless for them to work up such passion for the restoration of their independence. They want to be Prussian, answered the ambassador. Why not Russian? Rejoined the emperor indignantly. He turned his back on Monsieur Duprat, telling him to return in half an hour with the ministers who had been summoned. When Monsieur Duprat had gone to the emperor, launched into a long and violent tirade against him, accusing him of being afraid of the Russians, of having throughout the campaign frightened rather than reassured the Poles, and of having ruined all his plans in Poland. Carry out at once the order I gave you, he said sharply, referring to what he had written on the card which he had handed to me in Monsieur Duprat's presence. It said, "Send Marais word that fear of the Russians has made the Archbishop of Milan lose his head, that he is to dismiss him and put someone else in charge." I had thrust the card into my pocket. At the moment, I continued pacing up and down with the emperor without answering or executing his orders. Noticing his silence, I reminded him that dinner had been growing cold for some time, but he paid little attention to this, directing me again to carry out the order. After a moment, I pointed out to him that this change would produce a bad effect on the council at Warsaw. If Monsieur Duprat, I said, has, as your majesty thinks, played up the members of the council, he will be all the more acceptable to them at a moment of difficulty. No harm will be done by leaving him here for some time. He will do his best to remedy his errors, and circumstances will stimulate his zeal. He will even do better than a new man could do. If you dismiss him, he will say it is for having protected the interests of the duchy, and that will have a bad effect. The emperor then enumerated the different orders which the Duke of Bassano had given Monsieur Duprat concerning levies. He went into lengthy details as to the means placed at the disposal of the ambassador and the duchy, and concluded by saying, "You shall write from Posen. Now let us dine so that I can see the ministers and then start off." To keep the emperor from going back on his decision, I threw the card in the fire in his presence. Preoccupied by affairs, anxious to see the ministers and be on the road again, His Majesty did not remain long at table, although the cup of coffee we had snatched at Pultusk had refreshed us but little. "Business nourishes me," said the emperor, "and I have surfeit from discontent. This priest has annoyed me. What impudence! He complains of everyone, criticizes everything. What has he ever done to entitle him to blame others? He is losing this campaign for me." The emperor also received Count Tius, lieutenant general in command at Warsaw, who had nothing to say in praise of the ambassador's behavior in the moment of crisis. The emperor accorded a good reception to the ministers, who accompanied Monsieur Duprat. These gentlemen spoke of the dangers His Majesty had run and their happiness in seeing him in such good health. His mere presence was to them a guarantee of better days to come, and so forth and so on. The emperor brushed aside the idea that he had ever run any risks. He laughingly observed that rest and quiet were the lot of none but sluggard monarchs, adding that he thrived on fatigue. He told them that the army was still strong in numbers, with more than 150,000 men, which was hardly the truth. The Russians, according to him, were not holding out. They had been beaten in every direction, even at Berezina. These Russians were no longer the men of Eylau and Friedland. Before 3 months had elapsed, he would have as strong an army as he had when he opened the campaign. His arsenals were full. He had all the essentials and equipment and troops to make a splendid army. From his private study in the Tuileries, he could impose his will on Vienna and Berlin better than from army headquarters. I carry more weight when I am on my throne in the Tuileries than when I am leading my army, he said. He spoke of Marengo and Essling, battles that had been almost lost, yet which a couple of hours later had placed Austria at his disposal. I went into the other room to make certain that everything was ready. The sledges were drawn up before the door. I paid the hotel keeper, gave a few directions, and made notes of the strange conversation I had just heard. After dinner, while the emperor was at his toilet, I had jotted down particulars of what I had said to the ambassador and of his conversation with the emperor. As soon as I was able to pay attention to what was being said now, I heard the emperor attributing his reverses solely to the climate, and admitting that he had possibly stayed too long at Moscow, because having sent Lauriston to Russian headquarters, he had hoped to be able to conclude a peace. He said that Vilna would be held, but agreed that the Russians had shown strength of character, and that they loved the Tsar Alexander. The burning of Moscow, he acknowledged, had upset his plans. He emphasized the fact that it was the Russians who had set fire to their own capital. He spoke of the need for showing strength of mind on our side, adding that even grave reverses might lead to astounding successes. He talked with eagerness of the levies to be raised, especially of the indispensable Polish Cossacks. The ministers emphasized the distress of their country. The emperor did not seem to pay attention to this. Monsieur de Pradt supported them generously when they asked for money. The emperor granted some millions from the Courland assessment and from an issue of copper coinage, and concluded by announcing the imminent arrival of the diplomatic corps from Vilna. He then started to talk of his journey, and then I entered the room. The ministers urged the emperor to rest for a few hours while relays were being organized along the road. They inquired whether he would take the Silesia road by Glogau. Yes, by Prussia, answered the emperor. This crossing of Prussian territory, short though it was, worried him. He told them, questioning me as he did so, that I had given all the necessary instruction for relays, and that he was about to start at once. He then dismissed the ministers very graciously, amid their renewed expressions of devotion, in which they were all joined by Monsieur de Pradt, who seemed to have forgotten the rebukes administered before dinner. We mounted our sledge without further delay about 7 p.m. December 10th, and once again the emperor gave vent to his spleen against Monsieur de Pradt. He passed the most bitter comments on the archbishop's terror when the Russians had nearly reached the duchy, and on the bad example given by his behavior on that occasion. He spoke of his breeding and his manners, which were out of keeping, His Majesty said, with the education he had received, with the company in which he must have mixed, particularly with the religious calling he had chosen. The emperor kept on alleging that Monsieur de Pradt had lost in Poland and ruined his campaign. It had been a mistake to pay heed to foolish intrigues, and not Saint Talleyrand, who would have served him well, as he had previously done at Finkenstein, April and May 1807. The most difficult part of our journey had certainly been accomplished, but we still had to cross that little strip of Prussian territory after Glogau, and this worried the emperor more than all the rest of the journey. We traveled at great speed, but when a shaft of our sledge broke, we were obliged to stop at Kutno and have it mended, which delayed us more than 2 hours.